In February of 1979, five friends living on the island of Maui, Hawaii, decided to spend a relaxing day fishing. The group consisted of Benjamin Kalama, Peter Hanchett, Ralph Maliakini, Patrick Wozner, and Scott Mormon. All of them were local men, familiar with the sea, and used to spending time on boats. They were close friends, and fishing together was something they often did. Their boat was a small, 17-foot fiberglass vessel named the Sarah Joe. It was not a large or fancy boat, but it was strong and suitable for short fishing trips close to the coast. On the morning of February 11, 1979, the men met up to go out fishing from the town of Hana, on the eastern side of Maui. The weather seemed normal enough. The skies were partly cloudy, but nothing seemed dangerous or unusual. The men were in good spirits as they launched the Sarah Joe and set off into the Pacific Ocean. No one knew that this would be the last time anyone on Maui would ever see them again. Shortly after the men left shore, the weather changed dramatically. The Pacific Ocean is known for its unpredictable weather, and that day, a sudden and powerful storm blew in. The storm hit the coast with huge waves, high winds, and heavy rain. Locals later said it was one of the worst storms they had seen in years. Because the men were already out at sea in a small open boat, they were in extreme danger. When the storm passed, people expected the five fishermen to return, but they did not. Their families and friends waited anxiously on the shore, hoping the Sarah Joe would appear. Hours turned into days, and soon everyone realized something terrible had happened. The U.S. Coast Guard began a large search operation. Helicopters, planes, and ships searched hundreds of miles of ocean for any sign of the missing men or their boat. Friends, family members, and local fishermen joined in to help. Despite all these efforts, no trace of the Sarah Joe or her crew was found. It was as if the boat had simply disappeared from the face of the earth. The search continued for several days and then weeks, but eventually it was called off. The five men were officially declared missing and presumed dead. The ocean around Maui is vast, and it seemed impossible that such a small boat could have survived the violent storm. The people of Hana were heartbroken, and the story of the missing Sarah Joe became one of the saddest tragedies in the small community's history. After the storm and the failed search, time passed. The families of the five men tried to move on, but they never stopped wondering what had happened. The ocean is full of mysteries, and many people hoped that one day maybe a clue would appear. However, for almost 10 years, nothing was found. There were no pieces of the boat, no life jackets, and no bodies. It seemed like the Sarah Joe had been swallowed completely by the Pacific. Then, in 1988, something strange and unexpected happened. Thousands of miles away from Hawaii, on a small, uninhabited island in the Marshall Islands, a group of American scientists were doing research on marine life and sea birds. The island was called Taongi Atoll. It is one of the most remote places in the Pacific Ocean, completely deserted, with no people living there and rarely visited by anyone. It was more than 2,000 miles, over 3,200 kilometers, from where the Sarah Joe had disappeared. While exploring the island, one of the scientists noticed something odd lying on the beach. It looked like a piece of a small boat. As the team got closer, they saw that it had letters painted on it. The letters spelled out Sarah Joe. The scientists were shocked. They recognized the name from old news reports about the missing Hawaiian fishermen. This was the first piece of evidence of the Sarah Joe that anyone had found in nearly a decade. But the mystery deepened even further. As the scientists continued exploring the beach near the wreckage, they found something even stranger: a shallow grave made of carefully stacked stones. On top of the pile of rocks was a wooden cross, like the kind someone might make to mark a burial site. The scientists were stunned. The island was deserted. Who could have made a grave here? Inside the grave, they found a human jawbone and a few other small bones. The scientists reported the discovery, and authorities came to investigate. Later, DNA testing showed that the remains belonged to Scott Moorman, one of the 5 missing men from the Sarah Joe. No trace of the other 4 men was ever found. The discovery of Scott Moorman's grave only made the story stranger. There were so many questions and almost no answers. The grave appeared to have been made with care and respect. Whoever buried him had taken time to gather stones and build a small cross. Even more mysterious, inside the grave, there was a paper document sealed inside a plastic folder, something like a kind of official paper. The paper had been placed carefully near the remains, as if someone wanted it to stay dry. However, the paper had no clear information that could identify who placed it there or why. Experts examined the site and concluded that it was unlikely Scott could have built the grave himself. The grave looked like it was made by someone else, possibly long after he had died. But who could that person have been? Taongi Atoll was not visited often by anyone. It was isolated and had no permanent population. There were no records of any boats stopping there around that time. It was a true puzzle. Another big question was how the Sarah Joe could have ended up so far away. The distance between Maui and Taongi Atoll is over 2,000 miles, across one of the most dangerous and empty stretches of ocean in the world. Some scientists tried to study ocean currents to see if it was possible for the boat to drift that far on its own. They found that, in theory, it could happen. Ocean currents can carry floating objects long distances over many years. If the Sarah Joe had somehow survived the storm, even partially floating, it might have slowly drifted across the Pacific with the winds and currents. However, this would not explain how Scott Moorman's body ended up on the island in a proper grave. If the boat had simply washed up empty years later, who had been there to bury him? Over the years, many people have tried to explain the mystery of the Sarah Joe. There are several theories, but none can be proven for sure. One theory says that the Sarah Joe was blown far out to sea by the storm. The men may have drifted for weeks, possibly months, trying to survive with little food or water. Eventually, the boat may have reached Taongi Atoll. Perhaps one or more of the men made it to shore alive, but they were too weak to survive long. Maybe Scott Moorman lived the longest and died on the island, and later his body was buried by strangers who happened to visit. Another theory suggests that after the Sarah Joe drifted to the island, another boat, perhaps fishermen or sailors from another country, found it. They may have discovered Scott's remains and buried him out of respect, creating the grave and leaving the paper document behind. However, if that happened, it is unclear why those people never told anyone. It seems strange that no report was ever made about finding the wreck or the grave. A third theory is that the grave was made by other Pacific Islanders who occasionally visited the area for fishing or collecting seabirds. The Marshall Islands are sometimes visited by people from nearby islands, and perhaps they found the body and decided to give him a proper burial. Still, there are no records or witnesses to confirm this. Many parts of the Sarah Joe mystery are haunting because they suggest human care mixed with deep tragedy. The fact that Scott Moorman's grave was neatly built and marked shows someone wanted to show respect. The inclusion of the plastic-wrapped paper is especially strange. Someone took the time to seal it, as if leaving a message, yet no one has ever understood what it meant. Even more unsettling is that only Scott was found. What happened to the other 4 men remains completely unknown. If they reached the island together, did they die elsewhere? Did they try to find help and disappear? If Scott arrived alone, how did he manage to reach such a remote place? These questions have never been answered, even decades later. The disappearance of the Sarah Joe has fascinated and disturbed people for years because it combines elements of a sea adventure a natural disaster, and a ghost story. The Pacific Ocean is enormous and mysterious, and this case reminds people how small and fragile humans can be against nature. The boat vanished during a storm, and for 10 years there was silence. Then, out of nowhere, a piece of it appeared thousands of miles away, along with a single grave on a lonely island. It feels almost like a scene from a movie or a novel, yet it is entirely real. The case also touches on the theme of respect for the dead. Whoever buried Scott Moorman clearly cared enough to give him a proper resting place, even though they may not have known who he was. That act of kindness in such a desolate place makes the story even more emotional and mysterious. It suggests that somewhere in the vast Pacific, strangers crossed paths in a way that no one will ever fully understand. After the discovery in 1988, news of the Sarah Joe spread quickly across Hawaii and the United States. Journalists, scientists, and even paranormal investigators looked into the case. The U.S. Coast Guard reopened part of the investigation, but they could not find any new information. Over time, the case was discussed in documentaries, TV shows about mysteries, and books about the sea. It became one of the most famous maritime mysteries in modern times. For the families of the 5 men, the story brought mixed emotions. On one hand, finding Scott Moorman's remains gave them at least a small piece of closure. They finally knew that at least one of their loved ones had been found. On the other hand, the mystery of what really happened and why only one grave was found still causes pain and confusion. None of the families ever received a clear answer. Today, the story of the Sarah Joe remains unsolved. No new evidence has been discovered since the 1980s. The wreckage found on Taongi Atoll has long since washed away, and the island remains as empty and quiet as it has always been. Occasionally, people visit the atoll, but there is little to see, just ocean, coral reefs, and empty beaches. Still, the mystery lives on. It serves as a reminder of how vast and unpredictable the Pacific Ocean can be. It also shows how human stories can become part of the sea's larger, timeless mystery. The fate of the Sarah Joe and her crew may never be known, but their story continues to touch people's hearts, especially those who live near the ocean and understand both its beauty and its danger. The haunting disappearance of the Sarah Joe is one of the most puzzling true stories of the Pacific. What began as a simple fishing trip turned into a tragedy that has remained unexplained for decades. The sudden storm, the total disappearance, the reappearance of the boat years later, and the lonely grave on a distant island all combine to form a story that feels both real and unreal at the same time. It is a reminder of how fragile life can be and how powerful nature truly is. In the end, the Sarah Joe mystery leaves us with more questions than answers. We may never know how the boat traveled across the ocean, who buried Scott Moorman, or what happened to the others. Yet, the story continues to be told, generation after generation, as one of the most haunting sea mysteries ever recorded. A tale of friendship, loss, and the vast, unknowable power of the sea.